Hello, my name's Paul Smithson. I'm a member of the Hexagon product support team. Thank you for joining me for this webinar, which I'll be going through the Designer Electrode module. So within Designer, if you have the Electrode module active within your license, you'll find the Electrode functions. If you look in the toolbar, there'll be an Electrode option, which selecting that will then activate the Electrode ribbon. And within that ribbon, we've provided a number of functions that we think are relevant for the creation and management of electrode geometry. So you'll find within the ribbon work, plane, wireframe, and modeling functions. Now, me personally, I've actually added the cut bodies function to that ribbon. I find that particularly useful when I'm creating work planes. So some of the functions that have been provided you might find more relevant than others, so feel free to customize your ribbon to suit really. Now, also within the ribbon there are some dedicated electrode creation and management functions, and also some inspection point functions as well. So I'll be going through those in this webinar. So for the demonstration, I'm going to go through the electrode creation process. It's quite a structured process really. I'll go through as many functions as I can. So ranging from the tip extraction, so really extracting the sort of critical burn faces, and then defining that geometry as an electrode, so the system sees that geometry as an electrode within Designer, and then also adding holders, collision checking with those holders, and also the electrode management environment. So in addition to that, we'll cover some methods of creating documentation and exporting that documentation, and also the functions for checking our electrodes and creating inspection probing cycles really for those electrodes that we generate. So I won't focus on a presentation anymore. I'll get straight into the practicalities within the actual Designer product. So I have a piece of geometry here. It's got plenty of features in there that I need to extract as electrodes. And if I come up to the toolbar, you'll see I have the option here for electrode. So if I activate that, you'll see I've got work plane, wireframe, modeling, functions, but these are the main functions that I'm going to be focusing on in this demonstration. So the first thing I need to focus on really is deciding on where my origin is. So this is going to be my workpiece. So this is the piece I'm going to extract electrodes from. At the moment the origin is in an absolute position, so I need to adjust that. So if I come to create a work plane, I'm going to give this a relevant name. So if I just call this workpiece, and if I come and I'm going to put that in that corner there, and then pick a couple of points to get the orientation of the axis. So I've positioned my origin where I want my origin for the workpiece, and now I can start focusing on extracting geometry. So I'm going to focus on this rib, something simple to start with. So if I come to extract tip, so I'm going to extract faces, and if I just window select those faces, it selects the feature. If I right click now, it's going to extract that in a Z direction, which was my default direction. So within the interface here, I can interact, I can start to extract dynamically the geometry. I can see the blue faces are going to be the burn faces. If I just zoom in a little here, I can see just by visual inspection that there's taper on this geometry. And then if I come down to the yellow faces here where it's been extended, you can see I've got two options for either vertical or linear. So a vertical extension will not continue the tangency because of the taper. So if I come and change the extension to linear, you'll see that the extension is kept tangent, and also the geometry is extended out of the back of the electrode, which is handy for me as this breaks out of the back of the component geometry. So if I increase that extension, that's much better for me for machining. So I can come in and I can change the transparency of the electrode if I wish. I can change the color of the burn faces, and I don't normally personally do collision checks at this stage, but it is possible. So we have an additional tab here that if I come and say pick the body to collision check against, you'll see a little note in the bottom here of the interface, no collision detected. So at least I'm confident to move forward. This won't be the last time I'll do a collision check, so that's why I don't focus on it too much at this point. So you are able to sort of miss that step if you wish. So I'll accept that as my first electrode, something simple to start, like I said. I'll just shut the interface a second. So I'm going to focus on another piece of geometry now. So I've got a feature here, a bit more involved. So again, let's open up the extract tip, pick the faces. So again, I'm just going to window select that geometry. And what I'm aiming to do is pick the whole feature. I'm not aiming to just grab the ribs or just grab the main boss. I want to grab the whole feature. It makes life so much easier. So I'll grab that. I'll right click to confirm. Starts to create my electrode. It remembers the settings that I had set on the previous electrode creation. If I just drag this out, straight away I can see I've made a bit of an error there. So there's a hole in the bottom of that feature, which I've then gone and acquired that geometry as well. So I don't necessarily want that. I wouldn't be able to extract that anyway. So if I just come to the interface, I've got an option here to say, right, just reset the selection. If I plan this out a little bit more, if I think ahead and then before I make the selection, if I come up to the options here and say, well, only select the visible elements. So because I can see that this has all got taper on it, if I window select again and extract out, you'll see it won't be selecting that additional geometry. So it makes life a little bit easier for me. So I won't do anything else. I'll just accept this. And if I just come in to look at this piece of geometry on its own, if I look at this and start thinking about how am I going to manufacture this, well, I can't machine that as a single feature because I couldn't get the sharp corners in here. So I'm going to have to make some adjustments, and that's why we have all these modeling functions available to us. So if I come in and say, let's remove some faces. So I want to keep that face there. So right click. So you can see it's going to extend all the ribs for me, which is what I want because I want a single electrode in this case. So I might just as well put some radiuses in these areas here. If I turn on the rest of the geometry and just spin it around, just to make sure that radius doesn't impede upon the geometry, so it doesn't there, so that's fine. Accept that. So quite often what you're going to find is you're going to have to do some modeling functions to be able to give you a usable piece of electrode geometry. Okay, so let's just create another one. So let's just window select this. Now what you need to take care of, I've just made a mistake, but oh dear, come out of there. So let's start again. What you need to take care of is, because I've activated the visible elements, you need to deactivate that when you come to select your next piece of geometry. Otherwise you could end up not selecting all the geometry you want. So in this instance here, what's quite interesting is I'm using the linear extension, but what the system does, it tries to give me a nice flat here at the top here to cap the geometry, but the transition, it wants to extend this up in a linear a vertical extension, and that's not always helpful. So if I come to use these cut options in here, I can say, well, actually, if I minimize the top of the cut, you'll see it only gives me the linear extension. It doesn't give me any vertical extension at all, which can be handy, especially if I come to use the extension function. So if I activate this, what this will do is if I add an extension on, I can also put a taper angle on that extension as well. So if I've got some fragile electrodes, some really thin ribs, and I want to thicken them up during the creation process, I can use these options then just to add some taper on to give it some rigidity, some thickness when I'm coming to machine this. So let's accept that. Now, not all electrodes necessarily are going to be created using this extract tip. You might want to model them yourself, or you might want to have modeled them, or someone else has modeled them and you want to import them into Designer to use. So let's create another electrode by starting using a cube. That's just this features in here. So if I just come in and create a cube that's basically bigger than the geometry that I want to create. So I'll just put a cube in there. Again, I'll use the modeling function. So if I use a Boolean operation, I'm going to subtract. So that's my target, and that's my tool body. So I tick this on to make sure I keep my tool body because I don't want it to be removed. So let's just look at my geometry on its own. There we go. So I've got more than I need. It's a solid. So I'm just going to get rid of the features now that I don't want. So if I remove some faces, let's get rid of those. Right click, and if I just replace this face with that one, and this face with this one, if I just turn everything back on again. So I've got the start of my electrode there, and what I'm going to do now in a second, I'm going to define all these pieces of geometry, because at the moment they're just pieces of geometry. Nothing has been defined as an electrode at this point. Okay, so that will be the next step of the process. So now I'm going to move on to actually defining my geometry that I've already extracted as an electrode within the system. So within the ribbon bar, if I come to define electrode, now within this interface, first of all, I pick the geometry that I want to define as an electrode. So if I pick this rib here, the system will then automatically build a piece of stock material on top of that electrode. It'll see this as a single entity, so I can again slide it out dynamically, have a better visual inspection of the geometry. The system will add a name to this electrode, so you can choose from predefined name conventions, or you can pick the top option here and type a name in yourself if you want to choose it something different. You can select a material from a drop down. You can again predefine this within the settings. So I'll just go for copper. You can decide on the layer convention that you choose. Now the stock shape I've got created here is rectangular, but you can change this to be circular as well, and I'll do that on some other examples. Let's just put that back in place. So you can change the stock size dynamically. Now at the moment I've got a rectangular dimension, but it's been computed automatically from the size of the actual geometry that I selected for the blade. So it's automatically chosen these sizes, but I can adjust them manually. But if I want to choose from stock material I have in stock, I can again customize this within the settings, and I can come and say, well, let's choose that 15 mil stock, which will then automatically define it. I can change the angle of the position of the stock that's added. I can have a heel material for machining. I can either just turn that on and off, and I can also independently change that in relation to the actual stock material I'm using. So if I just extract this a little. So if I start looking at the origin of the electrode, so the origin will be created automatically and linked to the electrode geometry. So I can decide whether it's put on the top, so on the top here of the electrode, or the bottom, or I can manually select it. So if I want it in a certain position, or I can adjust the Z height. So let's put it back on the top there. So some other options that we have available, let's just zoom in. So we've got these chamfers added here. So for positioning and mirroring, I might want to adjust those marks. I may want them simply none at all. Stock, so I've just selected the marks tab here. So just on the stock, just on the heel, or on both. And then we've got options to be able to adjust the sizes and also the positions depending on which corner of the electrode we want them on. So moving on to the next tab, so we've got attributes. So these are basically text attributes that are assigned to this particular electrode, so we can decide whether, and these options will be displayed within the documentation later on. So we can decide on what electrodes get generated, so a roughing electrode with an oversized value, how many electrodes I want generated, and also assign a VDI surface finish for that finished electrode. So I'm not going to go for a semi-finisher, I'm just going to go for a finisher. Let's put a 21 VDI finish on that with a different oversize on. So I can also control the stock, so if I don't like the values that are coming out that are going to be added to the documentation, I might want to just round these up to make it easier for the setting of this electrode. And then a little further down, it's also referencing which work plane I'm referencing from this electrode to the workpiece electrode. Oh, sorry, the workpiece origin. There you go. So now at this point, I've also got a collision tab here. Now it's more critical for you to actually select the collision checking at this point, because it aids me, because it'll start to put this electrode automatically within the electrode manager. Now that'll only happen if you do a collision check at this defining electrode stage. So it's well worth doing it now, but you'll see that in a second. So the last thing really to show is we can also add in a holder. So if I click on the holder, it'll give me some already defined holders. I have by default the options to choose from System 3R, Hirschman, and Moisberger, and Aroa. So I'm just going to grab this one here. So it'll give me a 3D display. Now, depending on where your origin is for that electrode, if I was to hit just enter on the keyboard, it'll automatically put the origin of the holder on the origin of the electrode. Now I've added those, it sees that as an assembly. Okay, so if I accept that, just close the interface. Now if I quickly just open up the electrode, now I'll look at this electrode manager in a little more depth in a second, but you'll see that by doing the collision checking, it's automatically added in the workpiece, created a group, and put my electrode in. And then I can just tick that off just to hide it away while I concentrate on the other geometry. So let's define another electrode. So let's pick this piece of geometry here. Now it's automatically remembered the settings I had previously, so it's added this in as electrode 2. Let's quickly just do a collision check to show you what happens if we get a collision. So in this case, I've got a collision. It's telling me that I've got a collision here, 4.5 millimeters from the bottom. So it won't go down to the bottom burn position because there's a collision. So it's 4.5 millimeters shy of getting to its final position. I've got options here to either draw curves or just highlight where the collision is. So you can see it's just on the corner there. So I've got a collision here. So if I come back to the stock and make some adjustments, so if I say, well, let's put some circular stock on, it's still a bit big. So let's make this a bit smaller. That looks a bit better. So if I come now back up to this option here, now because I've already done a collision check, system knows what I'm colliding with. So if I just tick this option here, it'll do a secondary collision. Now I've got no collisions at all with that geometry, so a better solution. So if I click that option there, so that should have added that now again to the EDM manager. So I'll just hide that piece of geometry away. So now I've got two tips here, but I want to make a single electrode. So again, I'll define electrode, but this time if I turn on the multi-select, pick both pieces of geometry, right click to confirm. Again, it's remembering that I used round stock before and it's got the automatic solution on. So I want a rectangular option, so I've got to change back to rectangular. The other thing is I don't necessarily want this to be angled. I want it to be sort of use the minimum amount of material I can. So if I come in here and say auto compute, still too big, look. So if I come down to angle, I don't know what angle I need. So if I just highlight the option to say let's measure the angle I need. So I'm going to measure from that edge of my stock. If I just come into my geometry here, I know that's a feature on my electrode. So if I pick that, it'll automatically measure the position. If I just turn the shading back on, and you can see it's orientated the stock to be better positioned, and I can come in and just reduce the size. So let's go for 15. So I'll give that a quick visual inspection. Okay, that's good enough for me. I'm happy with that. So I'll do a quick collision check. Oh dear, I forgot the multi-select was on. Okay, so no collisions, and we'll accept that. And then that gets added to my EDM manager. So finally then, this last piece of geometry, now I modeled that as an electrode, so I don't need any stock add into this, and I modeled that myself, so I can still define it as an electrode, so I still need to use the define electrode option. Now I need to change the name, so if I pick this geometry, you'll see it starts to put the stock on for me, and I don't necessarily want to use the stock this time. Okay, so I've also got an angle in. I'm going to reduce that back to 0. So what I want to use is the define electrode. So all I want to do is define that piece of geometry as an electrode. So if I take this option on, you'll see the stock gets removed. And if I just accept that, or just to mention, actually, in this case, this is going to be an electrode that I'm going to use to create an undercut. So in this instance, I'm not going to use the collision checking because I don't want it to automatically add this to the to do any collision checking yet, because if I inadvertently, when I created this, I just picked a Z-axis, so I can't extract this through the Z-axis because of the undercut. So just to show, if I define this electrode, it creates the origin for me, but it doesn't add it to the EDM manager. So it won't highlight it as having a collision at this point, even though I know it has. So what I can do is I can come to group, right click, and say, well, I'm going to add in a new electrode. So it's already an electrode. So you can see there, it picks that as an electrode, and it'll add that into my EDM manager. I'm now going to look at the EDM manager in a little more depth. So you can see here that I've got a single group, and I've got 4 electrodes actually within that group. Well, I may want to manage these slightly differently, because I'm going to take some of these electrodes that I've already created, and I'm going to utilize them in a number of places over the workpiece. So to better manage things, if I create some additional groups within the manager. So if I select at workpiece level, right click and say create a new group, I'll give that new group a name. So I'll call it something that's relevant to the geometry. So I'll call it blade. It adds a new group into the list. I can then take any of my electrodes and simply drag and drop them into that group. So I can turn off the original group and then just focus my attention on the particular electrode that I've added into this new group. Okay, so I've also noticed I haven't got a holder on this particular piece of geometry, so because I'm going to drag it into new positions and duplicate it, I may well want to be able to collision check with the holder as well. So within the EDM manager, if I select the electrode, right click and say, well, I just want to add a holder from library. So if I come down and pick a relevant holder, you can see if I press the W key, it just turns the graphics on and off. Now, this is particularly handy for when I don't have the origin at the back of the sort of electrode, and where the origin is for this holder, as you can see, I have to position it manually. I can't just hit enter on the keyboard to get it to position in the right place, because that would put it down on the origin down here and it would be out of position. So I need to pick a position manually. So if I just come in and select a reference point there, it now puts it in the right position for me. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to duplicate this electrode. So I can do this from the EDM manager. So if I right click and I'm going to say, I've got a number of options for duplicating electrodes. So if I add a position by dragging, so if I just come into wireframe, so here's my electrode. I'm going to pick a point to be able to move it from. This will attach my electrode to my cursor. But now I've got a new position and it's not at the same angle, so I need to make an angle measurement. So if I come to the interface, come and measure between two elements. So if I measure between that and the original position, it doesn't necessarily put it in the right position for me. That's only because, so it's 124 degrees difference, but I just need to put a negative value in. And now you can see it's orientated the electrode to the correct orientation. So if I pick a point, that'll duplicate that electrode. I've also got a position over here where I can utilize this electrode again. Again, I need to measure the angle, so I'll go between this edge and this edge. The system will measure between the two features. You can see there it's actually not quite right for me. Again, it's 180 degrees out, so it's just simply a case of saying plus 180 degrees, press enter, and now you can see it's orientated the geometry correctly. So if I just pick a position now, turn my shading back on, you can see it's duplicated my three electrodes, duplicated it within the tree as well. And if I right mouse click, and because I've put it in a new position, there's plenty of opportunity for me to do that wrong. So if I just simply simulate the movement of those electrodes, it'll simulate the movement and do a collision check at the same time. So I've done a good job in this case, and those electrodes are in the correct positions. So let's just turn that off. Let's go on to a second electrode. So this particular electrode here, if I just simulate the movement of this just to check it's in the right place. Okay, so there's no collisions on that. So let's just add a holder onto this one as well. So before I do that, if I just come up to load holders, you can see I've got a number of manufacturers for holders, but I'm also able to add in custom holders as well. So if I've got custom geometry, I can add in my own holders. The process of doing that, I haven't really got time to show you now, but if I just show you within the settings, this is in the environment where we would activate any holders that we have created ourselves. So if I come in, there's two options. There's electrode settings. So if you want to customize any of the values that I've been selecting, you can do that from this area here. Or if I just come into the holders, you can see I've already added my own custom holders here. I simply add that to the right hand column here. So now if I come to add a holder to this electrode, so right mouse click, add from library, If I come to the manufacturer, you can see now I've got a hexagon option, and I can add in, so this is just something that I've downloaded, and I can add in that holder and utilize it for collision checking. Okay, so I'm not going to use this holder, so I'm just going to escape out of that in this case. I'm going to come back to a rower. Let's put on a holder which is bigger than I need really. So I'm doing this for a reason. So I'm going to hit W, pick the geometry that I want to select, put it in the right place. So it's a bit big, but if I come in now and do a simulation of this, okay, it's far too big. So there is now a collision check. This is just trying to highlight that it's highlighting, or the collision checking not only works on the electrode, it also works on the holder too. So I'm coming down within 1.5 millimeters. So how do I overcome this? So if I come back to the electrode within the electrode manager and come down to edit, this will open up the interface as I originally generated it. So I can then add some height either to the stock, or likewise to the heel height if I wish. I can now OK this, come back to my interface. You'll see it sends the electrode red to show me that there's a collision. So if I right click, say confirm that I've made some changes, and then simulate again, and now I've remedied the problem. So for electrode 3, I'm going to mirror this geometry. So I've created a single electrode there. I've got features where I can mirror that and utilize that single electrode in 2 positions. So if I select electrode 3 within the tree, if I right click and say I'm going to mirror that electrode, and if I come in and go equidistant point, and I'll just create or pick a couple of points there to mirror through. I'll just to get the right orientation, if I pick a feature there that I know is I want to mirror through, so to get me the right vector. So you can see it's mirrored the geometry in the right position. Now if I just right click that a couple of times and then shut that interface, so it's mirrored the electrode and it's also duplicated it within the tree. So it puts a little asterisk by it just to show the user that it's a mirrored electrode, a mirrored geometry, but it also says, come on, you've mirrored that, you should really check it. So if I right click, confirm the geometry, and then just simulate that geometry, it says there's no collisions, so I must have done a good job and mirrored it into the right position. Okay, so going on to electrode 4. Now this electrode, if you remember, it's an undercut feature, and initially when I created it I just picked a Z vector. I knew I was going to manage it, the direction of the movement of this electrode at this point, so I wasn't too worried about getting the vector correct when I first created the geometry. So at this point now though, I've created a line that gives me a vector, so it's an angled line, and I want to follow that line. So within the electrode manager, if I right click and say I want to select a processing direction, so I can pick either vertical or horizontal, but in this case I'm going to use inclined. So I'll just pick the end of the line, so that's my initial start position, and then if I just go into wireframe a second, pick the origin point for the electrode, come back and turn the shading on. So now I've picked those 2 positions. If I come back to the electrode 4 and ask the system to simulate the movement, it's just saying about the work plane. Okay, so as you can see there, it does a quick animation, says there's no collisions for that electrode. In this final example now, you can see I've got a much more complete number of electrodes. It's not all of them, but you can see already that the workpiece is getting pretty busy with all the electrodes available. I've just got 10 in here. So let's just focus on now generating some documentation for these electrodes. So I'll just look at one to start with. So within the electrode manager, if I right mouse click, I can create some documentation here. So the more automated method would be to create a HTML report. So if I simply click this, pick a location to create that that report, the system will go away and gather imagery for the report, and then it will produce a HTML report for me. So it's got all the relevant information, so the material, the shape of the stock, the size of the stock within the imagery that's created. It gives me overall sizes, a picture of the electrode itself, and also then, because I'm using that single electrode in 3 positions, it's noting the positions, so the measuring between the origins of the workpiece and the electrode itself. It's numbering them within the imagery and adding all the relevant dimensions. So in one button press, you've got all your relevant manufacturing information there. Okay, so if I come back to the interface, so you've got another method for creating documentation. Okay, so it's not done within the Electrode environment. So if I come over to the 2D drawing manager, open up the 2D drawing manager. So within this environment, you have an option here for creating electrode imageries. So the management of this, you can manage what's displayed within the imagery that's created. So you can manage the electrode itself and also the layout of both the workpiece and the electrode. And then finally, you've got some options in here. You can decide which electrodes drawings get created. You also have the ability to turn off holders and make various other setting changes within the top of the tree here. I'm just going to load in my own mask. So if I load in my drawing mask, so I want an electrode report mask. If I just update the settings, I'm going to create all the drawings for my electrode. So if I just hit the tick there within the top of the interface, you'll see the system's going off and gathering all the information it requires to create the reports for all of those electrodes that I had. Now I quite like this method because it gives us another level of interaction. So if I'm not happy with the initial imagery that's created, I'm able to easily adjust it. So hopefully it'll just be complete in a second. Okay, so you know when it's finished because it'll start to display imagery on the screen there. So if I just come up to the page manager here, you can see it's created 10 drawings of all my separate electrodes that I've generated. And the beauty of this now is that if I don't like any of the imagery, I can come in to the View tab. I can come and start either deleting geometry if I feel it's duplicated, or I can come in and if I want to translate views, I'm not happy with the spacing, I can come and easily move geometry, or if I think the scales doesn't represent the view very well, I can come in here, I can come, let's create a view. So if I come down, let's just create a detailed view. I'll make it twice the size. So if I pick that view there, that particular area, you can see I've got to place that over here. And it's twice the original size. I can go in and add additional dimensions just to clarify everything for the setters. So it's a nice mix of options really for creating documentation. So let's go back to the dynamic view. Let's open up my electrode manager. So let's pick a different electrode. So if I turn off the workpiece as well, just turn on electrode 5. So finally, the last thing I'm just going to cover now is creating some probing cycles for this electrode. So let's just shut that interface. So these options in here for creating probing cycles. So what I'm going to do is just add some points in here for probing, so to check my electrode before I use it. So if I create some inspection points, what I do is select the piece I want to add some probe points on. The system says, okay, your origin's non-active, so and the system will automatically activate the origin for that workpiece. So for the electrode, it gives me my probe point, and I can change the size of the ball, the size of the rod dynamically. So all I need to do is start positioning and selecting points on the electrode. So if I pick some points here, some points here, so I can put on as many as I wish. When I'm happy with the selection, I can right click. It will automatically create paths between the points. I can come in, I can delete any points I've put in that I'm not happy with. I can change the order that the points are probed in, and if I accept that result, basically it puts these little balls on just to show me that I've got some inspection points. I can come in and modify that if I wish, just by selecting one of them. It allows me to then adjust them as I did before, as I originally created them. And if I wish to export, I can window select, and you get a preview of the output that you're going to get. So you can change the formats, and you can visualize different formats by selecting them, and also select specific origins as well. This brings us to the end of the practical demonstration of the Electrode module within Designer. I'd just like to end the webinar by saying thank you for attending, and I hope you've seen something during this webinar that you found useful. Okay, so thank you very much, and see you next time.